so pleased to be able to share some messages with you around how your organizational cultures might be impacting your sanitation performance. At Cultivate, we work with food companies across the globe. We work with regulators, we work with universities as well to really figure out how can we best measure and change organizational cultures so that we can make safer food. We have a very specific mission, and that is to eradicate foodborne illness one culture at a time. So for today, I really want to start out with just sharing a bit of a story with you. Because when we have this great group like you together, we have to tie it all back to why we're focusing on food safety in the first place. Why do we sanitize? Why do we invest in equipment to be hygienically designed for hygienic purposes as well? I worked for Maple Leaf Foods in Canada for 11 years, and I lived in Canada for 15 years, and while I was there, I worked for Maple Leaf Foods. Maple Leaf Foods is a Canadian institution. It's an organization that for many years have made food that Canadians trust and like. And in 2008, on August 23rd, we were associated via DNA testing to the death of 23 Canadians. 23 Canadians who had consumed our sliced meat products contaminated with Listeria monocytogenes. I know exactly where I was when I was notified of this tragedy. I can tell you the color of the sky, the shape of the tree. I know how warm it was. I know how I reacted because I joined Maple Leaf to head up continuous improvement, and a company that I had come to love for about 4 years, we were now purely associated with death. So the average age of the 23 people who lost their lives was 76 years old. So people in the very vulnerable age where food safety is not just something that you get sick from and don't go to the doctor. It's an age group where it gets as serious as it was for us, where people lose their lives. One of the victims was in the hospital, and she had had a hip replacement not long before, and was mending, was doing well, was heading home for her birthday, and contracted listeriosis and passed away. Part of my job after this tragedy became to work with our organization to say, what do we need to do different? Based on the independent investigation report that the CFIA and Public Health Canada did, it actually quickly became evident that this was not a technical issue on its own. This was a cultural issue. These were assumptions that we had made at Maple Leaf as for what it meant to manage food safety effectively. The decisions we had made were, some of them were that we had hired what we believe were the best people to head up food safety, to be in our food safety department, that we scheduled sanitation every day, that we swabbed, and when we found listeria, we cleaned again, and we swabbed again, it was gone, our regulators were happy, and we would move on. So we made all of these assumptions as for what was good enough for food safety. And clearly, it wasn't good enough. Because 23 families today miss somebody that they love dearly because of the decisions we had made. I'm not trying to dampen the mood on a great event here, but when we talk about food safety and we have people like yourselves coming together at a fantastic educational session like this, we have got to bring it back to why we're investing in appropriately designed equipment, in people that sanitize our food factories every day, and how that influences the safety of the food we put out. So I'd like to share 3 things with you around how cultures are known to impact sanitation performance. One is around hazard and risk knowledge. So what do those that lead and work in food companies actually know about the hazards and risks that are unique to them? A little bit about measuring what you treasure. So how does data today maybe it's a little lazy for us. Maybe we need to do something different when it comes to what we're measuring and how we're using them to make sure that we can increase sanitation performance. And then I'm going to introduce you to this concept of psychosocial hazards and risks. If we start with the first one around knowledge. So we have polled for many years individuals that join webinars or other things. We ask them a very simple question. Do your senior leaders, the top 10 senior leaders in your company, know the food safety risks and hazards that you're dealing with specifically? Beginning last year, it was a 47% that they do. It's now gone up to end of last year to 52%. Not really a big difference. Our senior leaders and those that run food companies don't know enough about what they're doing when it comes to food safety. And that influences everything we do, from investment in equipment, from investment in those that sanitize our food factories. And I'll show you some data as for how much time you actually have to sanitize the factories or the restaurants that you run. So what we have to do is we have to create with these leaders what we call the right level or kind of anxiety. As adults, I love the question from the gentleman down here, how can we educate better? What are some of the go-tos that you asked, Jennifer? Jennifer also made the comment that it has to be tailored to the audience, how we educate and teach. And what we come back to over and over again is that we have to create the right level of anxiety, because as adults, we're actually not very good at learning. We have this concept that we toss around a lot at Cultivate. We can either be babies or we can be adults. If you're a baby, then you're not concerned about what you're going to say next when you're hearing somebody that's teaching you something. If you're an adult, then you're concerned about how I am going to respond to this. I'm actually not learning because I don't have the right anxiety. So when we go in and work with senior leadership teams, we do a lot about saying, okay, let us put a mirror up in front of you and show you who you actually are, because we would like them to know that their actions is about that they need their company, their brands, their consumers to survive what happens every day. So it's really about creating a little bit of a fire under them to make sure that they take actions. Wanted to share this one with you because I had the pleasure of sitting down with two of the CEOs that we work with, one from Birchwood Foods, who's a meat company in Wisconsin, and Quick Trip. Anybody know Quick Trip? Yeah. Anybody love Quick Trip? I'm seeing a lot of lovers. I love Quick Trip too. In this particular article, and you can scan the QR code and then you can download it, but these two CEOs are very transparent around what they didn't know and what they didn't know that they didn't know. So they're very much telling the stories from CEO to CEO as for what is it that I didn't know, and therefore why did I make the decisions that I did when it comes to food safety. So it's a bit of a call to action for other CEOs. The second topic that I just wanted to also share some thoughts with you about is around sanitation measures. One of the things we've started doing a lot with our clients as well, because it speaks to culture, is to actually say, how long does your sanitation shift last? 8 hours. Okay. How long does your sanitation shift last? And especially operations folks, they go, no, I just told you, 8 hours, we have a full shift. Do you have a full shift? So then we start gathering data and we say, so when did production stop? When did sanitation start? When did production or QA, when did they come in and do their pre or visual inspection? When did you start production back up? And more often than not, we find that it is far from 8 hours that sanitation gets to do their job. Because production runs over, because we're making great products and therefore we have more demand than we have capacity, so we have to run over. And then I find it miraculously when I then sit down and I ask, so when did you start? Oh, we start the same day or time every day. So sanitation shifts are often the ones that get shortened because we need to make product, which we do. Food companies are not philanthropic companies, need to get product out. That's absolutely fair. But when we keep seeing that shortening of the sanitation shift, I start to ask the question, so There's one or two things happening here. Either you haven't actually done your assessment of how to clean and how long time that's supposed to take correctly, because you can do it clearly much shorter, as you can see in the chart. Some days they have much shorter sanitation shifts. So is that because you haven't actually done your master sanitation schedules correctly, or your SSOPs are not right, or what's happening? Or you're shortening, and therefore sanitation have to make some decisions to say, what are we going to get done, what are we not going to get done? When we talk about measuring what you treasure, this is a leading indicator for your food safety culture, the duration of your sanitation shift. Because we can't really say food safety without saying that we have to know how we're doing from a sanitation perspective, and are we getting done all the tasks that we said we were going to get done. And if you're not measuring whether you're doing those tasks and also have the time dedicated to do that, then you might be in a culture where it's actually more important that we get product out the door as opposed to getting a proper sanitation. So measuring what you treasure for me is around saying, what are those key indicators that influence whether food is safe? Sanitation tasks are clearly one of them. If you're shortening sanitation shifts, can you get everything done you said you were going to do? And if you can, well, good for you. Maybe you actually have more production time than you thought, or you're shortchanging the very step that makes your food safe every day. When we started looking into at Maple Leaf what had happened during the recall, what had led up to this tragic event, we found that our sanitors used a lot of high-pressure hoses, moving meat around with high-pressure hoses, because it was an effective way to get through the tasks of, first and foremost, cleaning before sanitizing. Listeria had migrated in through, in some cases, these little gaskets that are on the back of electrical cabinets. So Listeria had migrated through that and made it from there onto product contact surfaces where sliced meat was being transported down to a pack line. So we were feeding Listeria in through this electrical cabinet on a regular basis because we were using high-pressure hoses. When we started diving into, so why is this happening? Well, it's because of time, right? We found a method that we can actually clean faster, and we swap, we find something, we re-clean, and then we swap again, it's gone. So we just went through that perpetual cycle. But it did come back to time. And did we actually see both a balance between time and effectiveness for sanitation? We also found that some of our meat slices, they were just really difficult to clean. They were very difficult to disassemble. They were very difficult to get into those nooks and crannies where we know that Listeria likes to live when it's nice and cozy and warm and moist. So we started steaming our slicers. We pack it, we put a big plastic bag over it, and Steve Tiyuki, who I had the pleasure of working with, he invented this whole system of put your slicer in a bag, hook it up to steam, and if there's anything living in there, I guarantee you it's dead when you're done with it. Unfortunately, some of our slices died too. But I think it's a perfect example to say hygienically designed equipment, or equipment that we can actually use in the food industry, because we know that we can remove the risks that could potentially make people very sick, or in worst case, take their lives. The other thing around measure what you treasure is around cost of quality or cost of poor quality. And we're doing more and more work in this space, because something like process equipment, preventative maintenance, or sanitation time, or all of these various factors that impact what it's costing us to run our facilities have to be measured, accumulated, so that we can give our leaders something to chew on when it comes to food safety and say, hey, this is the cost of making safe food every day. So let's talk about, if we have the budgets to do that, what it's costing us and what we need to do to potentially reduce costs, because we're investing in better equipment that could actually lead to that we can clean faster. So cost of poor quality is just a wonderful measure for that. The last thing I wanted to just introduce you to, and some of you might know this from people safety, but it's psychosocial hazards and risks. And this is where we're taking food safety systems and we're balancing them, or we're integrating them with what we do for food safety culture. And we do that because we're still seeing in our assessments, and this is not a statistic that's unique to us, but across a little bit more than 4,000 sites or manufacturing facilities that we've measured in, 73% still believe that the biggest challenge they have is actually to create lasting change for food safety in the companies. And it has to some extent to do with that we're treating change as a process where we're taking the people side of things out. So we're saying, okay, we have a change to a piece of or process or to a product. We go through a change process for that. It's a very system-oriented type of change. But we forget that in most cases, food is not made just by a machine. It's made by a whole pile of people. And unless we're integrating the human factor, or as I'll show it to you as a psychosocial hazards and risks, then we're really living in a sort of a little bit of a false sense of security. Because we're saying, hey, we went through the change process, we've updated our documents, we have the data we're collecting, we are passing audits, and everything is good until it's not. Because food safety is not, it doesn't live in systems, it lives in food safety systems and culture. We look at that to say, okay, let's integrate risk areas. Let's say that hazards are both food safety, they're people safety related, and then we have these psychosocial hazards. When we talk about food safety, we all know these. There are 3 types of hazards: biological, chemical, and physical. For example, we're looking at listeria or cleaning chemicals, or maybe it's tips of a blue glove that makes it into a product somewhere. Then we have safety hazards, so they can also be biological, physical, and chemical. Pathogenic microorganisms that is actually dangerous for individuals to work with, or it could be physical from a confined space perspective. We can have cleaning chemicals there as well. Then we have these psychosocial hazards. And I wanted to show this to you as a group because I think the more we can integrate our perspective on hazards and risks around food safety, people safety, psychosocial hazards and risks, the more complexity we can take out for those that actually have to manage all of these different hazards every day. Last time I checked, most food factories just have one plant manager, and often they don't only have one quality manager. They're lucky if they have a people safety manager. So the more complexity we can take out by integrating how we're looking at hazards and risks, the less complexity we're introducing to those that actually have to manage it. So when we talk about psychosocial, we're looking at motivation, job changes, work environment, and how that influences, how that can become risks to making safe food every day. For example, the information infrastructure. How does information actually flow throughout a food factory? How does it flow from and to? How does people get involved? How can they speak up? That influences whether you have higher risks for food safety and people safety. Job changes. Are we setting expectations that if your job changes, we're going to involve you and help you make change as opposed to just giving it to you and off you go? Because that, again, will raise the issue with, am I actually going to look out for food safety and people safety because I'm so worried about my own existence? And do I have a job tomorrow? And I'm not looking out for food safety and safety. Work environment is another one. Are we reacting to failures and mistakes, or are we saying, yeah, do you know what, it happens every time we run that piece of equipment, that product is always a little bit of sort of a bugaboo, so we're just going to get through it and get the product and then we'll be fine. So we've just accepted that we have some subpar processes, and instead of actually saying, that's not acceptable, let's look at what's happening, those are 2 different cultures, and one will increase your food safety risks, the other one will lower it. So we're really looking at putting those 3 types of hazards together because we want to help our plant managers actually do their jobs a little bit more easy. So I'm going to share an example with you from one of our clients. It's a dairy company in Australia, and I thought this one would be relevant in this context that we're in here today. We have this situation where one of our clients had a recall because they had found a cleaning chemical residue in their milk. So milk had gone into cartons, cartons had gone into retail. Retailers were obviously selling that on to consumers who found cleaning chemical in their milk. So what happened? They had done a system risk assessment, like many do. Most people have HACCP systems, food safety management programs. We go through identifying the hazards, we do the risk assessment. Is it likely going to happen? What's the severity if this is found in our food, etc.? And they had said the risk is low. Because we have CIP systems, we test, and no, we're good. There's really very little risk here. So with that low likelihood and the medium severity, because obviously cleaning chemicals are most often they're not meant to be consumed, they said this is not something that we are going to change any programs because of, or we're not going to teach people how to deal with this in a different way because it's really not an issue for us to work with. So then we started diving into what had happened, and we found that there was a nozzle where the milk was filled into cartons that had to be removed when sanitation was doing their work. And that fill nozzle was so difficult to remove that they had to call maintenance to do that. So it wasn't something that sanitation they couldn't just take it apart because it took some special types of equipment to actually do that or tools to do that. So that hadn't been cleaned properly because sanitation couldn't actually really get at it, and maintenance had to help them when they did their work. But here's what the situation in the plant was. The maintenance manager position was open. So the maintenance manager had left. There was a new maintenance technician who had been called by the senator in that area to say, hey, we need this nozzle removed because we need to get on with cleaning here. And that maintenance technician had not been trained properly, didn't actually know what to do or why it was important. And together with the senator, they sort of said, yeah, do you know what? We just can't do this today. So the nozzle wasn't removed. It wasn't cleaned the way that it was spec'd out in the system because there was little management support. The maintenance manager wasn't there at all. The maintenance technician was new, and the senator really just needed to get on with things. Why? Because the prevailing norms from leadership was one of, or many of, that we have to maximize our throughput here because there's too little milk in the market. I don't know, but there was massive drought issues in Australia for a number of years ago, and that impacted the dairy industry tremendously. So that was just not a good situation. So they were really concerned about customer fill rate in this company. There wasn't really any regular messages that came from leadership as for why food safety is important, nor was food safety something that others were recognized for. So if the senator had come up with, in collaboration with maintenance, another way of disassembling this nozzle, or maybe it was a whole new equipment piece or design that had needed to be invented, nobody would have recognized them for that because that was just not a norm that leadership would take or act on. There was also a retention issue in this particular plant, and therefore lots of churn in frontline staff and supervisors. So the plant leadership was really focused on that more so than what was happening around sanitation and maintenance. The prevailing norm in sanitation and the maintenance group they were totally clear on their goals. It was about getting product out the door, and they wanted to be part of that success. They also were in a situation where they had extremely high workload and they ran fast. So they didn't have enough people on the sanitation shift, and they had this difficult piece of equipment, and therefore it actually led to that they took shortcuts, and this was just one of them. They also were in a situation where this, as I mentioned before, these managers, especially the maintenance manager, just wasn't there. So there wasn't anybody to help them. So the normative gaps, and that's what we look at when we do assessments of culture and how it influences food safety, was really one of where vacancies and retention in these critical roles, they weren't really filled. There was no sense of urgency for getting those roles filled because there was little connection back to HR, for example, to say, why is it so critical for not just maintaining equipment that we get this maintenance manager role filled, but also why is it critical for us even to send a product out the door. So that because we can't send product out the door if it's not safe, it's not food, and therefore there wasn't really this sense of urgency from HR. And there was this lack of messaging around what's important to us. I go back to measure what you treasure. Because the company was so focused on, because of the situation of the drought and everything else, we just need to get milk in cartons and help people get their dairy every day. So these commercial goals really overshadowed the details, the psychosocial hazards around, I'm on my own, I don't have peer support, I don't have management support, I have a way too high workload. And because all of those 4 things weren't integrated into how they'd done their risk assessment for food safety in the first place, people thought they were okay because the risk is low. When in fact, when we then went back and did the risk assessment with them, when we went back and then we took those psychosocial hazards, so the workload, the peer support, the management support, and also whether I actually have control over what I'm doing, did the risk assessment through hazard again, and the risk was high. It was high likelihood because of these situations that this could occur again. Severity is the same, we can't play God, but the risk was high after this learning. We don't want anybody to have to go to market and pull product back, because when you're in that situation, the likelihood that somebody is actually going to get sick, you're already losing that game. So we want people to start putting these psychosocial hazards into their hazard analyses. We want you as manufacturing equipment suppliers that you actually incorporate some of these type of thinking as well, because it'll help you when you sit across those decision makers that have to purchase your equipment that might be more expensive because it is actually optimal for food safety. But if you tie it back to an example like this, the case that we've been going through with this company, is actually pretty evident why you should be investing in well-designed equipment up front and not after the fact. Well, it is to me. There's a paper on this system and culture collision that or an article that I had the pleasure of writing with a colleague of mine, and it's in Food Safety Magazine as well. It's available to everybody. Nobody is asking you to pay anything. We just want you to know. This is about you knowing how these things, like in psychosocial and people, come together with systems, come together also in the argumentation as for why we have to upfront invest in these things and not after the fact. So grab a hold of that one if you want to learn more. I'm going to wrap up with just this little story of Bindi and Sue, who just so happens to be also in Australia, but they're in the produce industry. This company, One Harvest, is a client of ours. And when I come to Sydney to do some work with them in that plant, I'm met with, or by one of their frontline team members, not met by the plant manager or somebody else, because they have a very mature food safety culture. They spread it out and they say, well, people coming in, take them around, or if they need to do work in the plant, why don't you become the spokesperson? And in this case, I was in the plant with them, and Bindi, who's on your left there in the blue hairnet, has been doing her work in this plant for a long time. So they're at a conveyor where freshly harvested baby spinach or a rocket or other types of salad comes in, and it comes onto the conveyor, and then their job is to sort through and look for physical or extraneous material. Sue is in a red hairnet because she was in training when I was there with them. And I'm standing there just just observing what was going on, and I like to just blend in with the wall. And Sue, in the red hairnet, at one point she was bending down and she was going to pick up this baby rocket salad that was on the ground, had fallen off the conveyor, and she was going to take it and she was going to put it onto the conveyor. Bindi looks very friendly in this photo. She almost took Sue down because she first, don't do that. Don't pick anything off the floor, put it on the conveyor. And then she continued to explain why. But she did something that was really profound to me as well. She also asked why. Sue, why would you do that? You've been trained. You know that we don't do this. And Sue says, well, do you know what? There's all these farmers who have been growing this salad, and they do such a good job, and it's hard to be a farmer, and I don't want product to go to waste. Sue did not do this because she wanted anybody to get sick. She didn't do this because she wanted to increase food safety risk for one harvest. She did this because she thought she was doing the right thing. Bindi told her in some terms that I shall not repeat, that that's just not what we do around here, and here's why. I believe that when we do what we do, all of us in this room, for food safety every day, this is why we do that. Because we want to have as many Bindis and Sues at the front line of where our food is made that can make this kind of decision every day when they see a risk that could potentially cause harm to others. And with that, I'm going to say thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for spending your morning with me. As mentioned, we're going to be talking a little bit about legal considerations and what the risks are from a legal side with not following hygienic design principles. So a little bit first about my background. I worked first in food safety for about 10 years, really on the ground, understanding what those risks are, and then went back to law school and now work for a law firm dedicated exclusively to supporting the food industry on legal considerations. With that said, I'm not a hygienic design expert, not an engineer. I would love to be, but I am not, and I can't really help with those types of questions. And my perspective is US-based. With that, today we're going to be looking at the worst case scenario. What can go wrong when we don't follow hygienic design principles? So this is from an FDA memo investigating a foodborne outbreak about 10 years ago. And to note here, uncleanable covers on a food contact conveyor, deep crevices on a roller bar assembly. Despite cleaning, the equipment still needed additional cleaning. Excess residue on those same roller bars. An investigation with the equipment supplier for that particular piece of equipment demonstrated that the equipment supplier had refabbed an existing piece of equipment to attempt to be used for cantaloupes, replacing brushes. This particular vendor installed a chlorine wash system, but was unsure if that was installed and in operation. The vendor determined that this piece of equipment was in good condition prior to sale, without really evaluating what was going on. And most importantly, in my opinion, this vendor provided this equipment without any manuals or guidance on how to maintain or clean the equipment, both in its original form and in its refabricated form. This was all part of the Jensen Farms cantaloupe outbreak back in 2011, and this resulted in almost 150 ill and a total of 33 deaths across the country. Genetic testing was done to determine that the bacteria that caused those illnesses was in fact present on those conveyor belts, on those roller bars in this particular facility. It was a converted potato washer that had been refabricated to be used for cantaloupe rather. Though we certainly don't want 150 people ill, 33 deaths, the individuals involved in this also faced dramatic personal and company-wide repercussions. So criminal charges were lodged against the two individuals at Jensen Farms, the Jensen brothers. They each faced 6 criminal counts. Each one of those counts came with up to a year in prison and a fine of up to $250,000, totaling $1.5 million per person in criminal fines, potentially. Now, these charges are strict liability. Your intent does not matter. If Department of Justice can demonstrate that you did, in fact, sell adulterated food, they can bring charges without showing that you intended to do that. And criminal charges are possible against both the company and those individuals who are responsible at the company. Typically, we see this as the CEO, but directors of food safety, directors of sanitation, other senior officials of the company can also face criminal charges. Both brothers ended up pleading guilty. They were sentenced to 5 years of probation where they could not work in the food industry and payment of restitution of about $14,000. This was paid to those victims of those 33 dead, or to the families of those victims. As an aside, the Jensen Farms insurance policies also paid out about $4 million to those families, again, to compensate for those wrongful deaths. In the guilty plea, the brothers state, despite these modifications that we had done, we never actually used our chlorine wash system. It was never actually implemented. The brothers knew that a chlorine wash system was necessary for their cantaloupe, a ready-to-eat product, had the work done by their equipment vendor to install a chlorine wash system, but never actually used it. As a note, Jensen Farms had undergone a third-party food safety audit about a month before the beginning of the outbreak. This resulted in a score of 96%, essentially perfect. Despite this third-party audit, there were clear issues with the food safety systems in place here, with the equipment, with the design, and the functioning of that cantaloupe wash system. The third-party auditor involved here was also sued a number of times by both the victims as well as downstream vendors of the cantaloupe. Those typically resulted in a joint dismissal, which typically suggests a private settlement occurred, but this was just a month before the outbreak. Now, a few recommendations for you as you think about how to minimize your risk from a hygienic design principle. At its core, what would a jury think? If we hold that question as our predominant guiding factor, you'll make the right decision in most cases. What would 12 individuals listening to this story think? More practically, what education can we offer to users? Can we provide guidance on how to wash and use, maintain, clean, sanitize our equipment? Can we incorporate designs that make it foolproof to incorporate food safety? And can we prepare for the unexpected? Can we prepare for a company to misuse our equipment, to refabricate our equipment, or to otherwise deviate from the intended perspectives? So with that, just wanted to leave with a short note on the potential liabilities associated with food safety deviations, with the risks that do exist, and those are certainly civil monetary penalties, but also there is that opportunity for criminal when deviations become very dramatic. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation, and I really enjoyed the previous presentation and the questions, and I think that mine will flow very smoothly from that, and it wasn't even coordinated. So a little bit about me. I'm a food microbiologist by background. I found my way into food safety kind of by chance. I've worked across different industries, working at the Institute of Food Technologists, which is for food scientists across the board, grocery manufacturers, more the processed food side, and then for the last 8 years, more on the fresh produce side, each of which has unique challenges. So a few key points that I want to make before I really dig in, things I want to have you walk away with. First is that I think in the area of hygienic design, we've made progress, substantial progress. I'm not sure that it's always been fully embraced voluntarily, and I want to talk about some of the drivers of change that I see, both from the regulatory standpoint and other more reactive drivers. That said, despite the progress that has been made, we continue to see food safety issues. Liz talked about FDA's swabathons, doing environmental swabs, looking for things that we couldn't as easily see before. And this has revealed that we do have problems that need to continue to be addressed. How do we continue to make progress? I think it's through collaboration and it's through sharing across different parts of the industry, which hasn't happened to the extent that I think it could. So as I thought about this kind of cross-cutting, looking across different parts of the industry, I thought, well, what are some of the key things that I think of when I think of milestones in hygienic design specific to industries? Dairy being 3A is historically known for dairy. I know that that's evolving and that 3A's presence is more widespread today than just dairy. But a lot of our hygienic design experience is rooted in the dairy industry. And 3A is codified in dairy, right? So the language is here, it's called out, it's quite specific, and standards provide a standard. Then I think about the meat industry, which I think has achieved a level of maturity compared to where it was maybe 30-ish years ago. We have the Meat Institute, who's put together some documents, a little snippet here that is not as prescriptive, not as clear as a standard, but still leads their members into a good direction when it comes to what one should expect, what one should be looking for. And then at the tail end, I have, for me, a more recent experience on fresh produce, so watermelons. And yes, it is a hollowed out school bus that you see in the background. And on the Eastern Shore, I'm from Maryland, the Eastern Shore, this is not an uncommon sight, an uncommon piece of equipment to transport your melons. And I would not be surprised if inside the school bus there's some sort of sponge, foam, carpet perhaps to make sure that these melons are not bruised as they're put in the hollowed out school bus. So this is where the different parts of the industry may be when they're thinking about how do we handle our product, what does hygienic design mean? And it struck me as I'm putting this together that while the rigor or standard seems to be decreasing as we move from the dairy side to the watermelon side, the time is increasing. And so there's this juxtaposition, I think, of where different parts of the industry are, where different parts of the industry have been. And this, to me, really reinforced the idea that there needs to be better sharing of practices from different parts of the industry. So what drives change? What forces food producers to adopt better practices? Regulations, you don't have a choice, right? So that is going to induce change because you have to. It is now a regulation. We also see change when there are issues that just can't be denied within an industry, within a commodity group, within a product category. So when there are numerous outbreaks, high-profile outbreaks, headline news, things that your average consumer starts talking about, an industry sees they need to change, or their industry, their category becomes vulnerable. I worked several of the romaine lettuce outbreaks. That is an industry that, not through a regulatory imposition, but through the court of public opinion, had to change many of their practices. I think for the most savvy producers, they may come to the realization that there could be a cost benefit of improving hygienic design. I think we usually, most people think of it as cost, it's going to cost more, the equipment costs more. But as companies start to struggle with labor in particular, with concern about usage of chemicals, this is where they may see some benefit. But that's the top of the pyramid. That's the smallest area that I see. There was some discussion of regulations, and I wanted to pull up some language. So there was a question about the preventive controls rule. Most of the language that's arguably related to hygienic design resides within the good manufacturing practices part of the preventive controls rule. So not the preventive controls themselves, but just the underlying foundational good manufacturing practices. But you'll see the language that I pulled here. All plant equipment and utensils used in manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding food must be so designed and of such material and workmanship as to be adequately cleanable. to me, there's some subjectivity in that, adequately cleanable. It goes on to say seams on food contact surfaces must be smoothly bonded or maintained, blah, 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 thus to minimize the opportunity for growth of microorganisms and allergen cross-contact. Again, not the world's strongest standard here. FSIS has language that's kind of similar on the meat and poultry side, so equipment and utensils used for processing or otherwise handling edible product or ingredients must be of such material and construction to facilitate thorough cleaning. Well, who decides that? Who can really put some teeth behind that and say that, yes, this is of such material and construction to facilitate thorough cleaning? So I think the language in the PMO is the exception when we look at regulations. While I was sitting there, and as Liz was talking about cantaloupe, so cantaloupe, at the time that the outbreak occurred, 2011, there was no real regulation for fresh produce, specific to fresh produce. There's always a regulation that you can't produce contaminated food, but produce as an entity had not been regulated. Now produce is, but produce wouldn't fall under any of these here. So I'll read the language in the produce safety rule that is specific to cleaning, essentially. And you tell me if you think that the Jensen brothers would have read this rule, which would have applied to them, and if it would have prevented the outbreak. So the way the regulation is written, it starts with the question of what general requirements apply regarding equipment and tools subject to this part. The answer in the regulation, it's a Q&A style regulation. The answer is you must use equipment and tools that are of adequate design, construction, and workmanship to enable them to be adequately cleaned and properly maintained. Goes on to say equipment and tools must be installed and maintained as to facilitate cleaning of the equipment and of all adjacent spaces. It has pretty similar language to the seams. Seams on food contact surfaces of equipment and tools that you use must be either smoothly bonded or maintained to minimize accumulation of dirt, filth, food particles, and organic material, and thus minimize the opportunity for harborage or growth of microorganisms. And there's a little bit more. Do you think that that would have prevented the outbreak? Based on what Liz had shared, based on the FDA inspection, they thought they were cleaning it, right? And the requirement is, it just needs to be good enough, you need to be able to clean it. So I'm not sure that currently the regulatory drivers are really what are pushing the industry forward. There's other government but non-regulatory programs, and I was able to talk to Susan from USDA AMS on the dairy side last night. So USDA offers 2 voluntary fee-based, so user fee-funded, equipment review and certification programs. Dairy is one, meat and poultry being the other. What about all the other food products? Today, we don't see as many issues with dairy as had been 100 years ago, or meat and poultry as 30, 40 years ago, but we have other parts of the food system that are much further behind. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to help those parts of the industry who are perhaps a little bit in the dark and in need of some assistance. I see food safety drivers, outbreaks, being a greater contributor to change today than the regulations. So when there is some sort of food safety issue, it boils down to 3 causes. Was it from the ingredient? And the question was asked before, and Chipotle, well, wasn't an ingredient. So that's one category that can result in an outbreak or a recall. Was it due to processing within that operation, so they didn't meet their time temperature, something like that? Or, the green box, was it because of an issue with their equipment, with their facility? And we do see, especially for some of the listeria outbreaks and recalls, That is the issue. For USDA FSIS, the data that are most currently available, I've highlighted the number of recalls. Now, these recalls don't necessarily, and in fact usually don't link to cases of illness, but they could. I've highlighted the Listeria monocytogenes. 6 of the recalls are due to Listeria monocytogenes. By pounds, maybe not tremendous volumes of product, but in terms of numbers, kind of in the middle there, not inconsequential in the grand scheme of FSIS recalls. On the FDA-regulated side, USDA pulls their own data together. FDA doesn't pull their own data together quite as easily. So FMI, which is the retail organization, they provided a nice summary. Year over year, 2017 to 2020, it's the gray bar that is the Listeria-related recalls. The others are Salmonella and undeclared allergens. Undeclared allergens is always at the top, but you see that this gray Listeria recalls, which again are not necessarily related to illness, but there are a substantial number of them, a measurable number. You don't see, E. coli is not on this list. There are some other reasons for recalls that are not on the list. These are some of the tops, and Listeria is toward the top. If we looked back at reasons for recalls maybe 20 years ago, I'm not sure that Listeria would have been at the top. We hunt for Listeria now. We find Listeria now. We're able to link it to cases of illness. Liz had mentioned in the Jensen Farms outbreak, a tool was used, pulse field gel electrophoresis, to show that the organism found on that equipment was the exact, well, almost exact same organism found in people. Our tools today now show exact, like exact, really getting into the genetics of the organisms. And this allows FDA, when they're doing the swabathons, they come into your facility, they find Listeria monocytogenes, they'll put it in a database, a publicly available database, to see if it matches any clinical cases of illness, not just from today, but perhaps from years ago. They'll also come back to your facility, even if it doesn't match clinical cases, and if they come back to your facility and they find the genetically exact same organism there, they often say it's because your normal routine sanitation is inadequate. And why might it not be adequate? Is the organism stuck in areas where, due to deficiencies in hygienic design, these are places that are not cleanable, not readily accessible, where the organism and other gunk can hide? So whole genome sequencing, I say it's like the 23andMe or the Ancestry.com for bacteria. It shows the brothers, sisters, cousins, mother, father, so you can see how related these organisms are. So I want to pull up 2 fairly recent examples where I think, one, I know hygienic design was the reason for the outbreak, and the other where I suspect, I did not work with the Quaker Oats company on this issue, but to see that there had been a salmonella issue associated with Quaker Oats, and the company, this is from their own statement, we paused production at the facility. After a detailed review, we determined that meeting our future manufacturing needs would require an extended closure for enhancements and modernization. To me, this suggests, and again, I don't know, but it suggests that there were some issues there that couldn't be easily remedied. That this was not that, oh, somebody, some sanitor didn't do their job and they just need to scrub a little bit harder. That there were issues here with the design of equipment, with the design of the facility that were not repairable. On Dole, and this harvest equipment is not from Dole. I have seen the pictures of the harvest equipment that was used by Dole that was linked to a Listeria outbreak. So it's not just equipment indoors in processing facilities. The spotlight is now shown on equipment, moving parts, anywhere in the food supply chain. When Dole took the equipment apart, they found they found the listeria. They found by whole genome sequence the strain that was causing illness, and they found it pretty readily. Even though this harvest equipment had been what they felt, cleaned and sanitized to the extent that's practical in an outdoor growing environment. But this is where, because of this outbreak, much of the leafy greens industry now is taking a fresh look at their harvesting equipment and trying to figure out how can it be hygienically designed. How can you hygienically design something that is going to reside outside in the elements, that if too heavy, if everything is solid, sinks in the mud. So it presents some unique challenges, I think, when we think about how we adapt some of our learnings from other industries, from different environments, to other industries working in other environments. I just want to show an example in talking about listeria and the ability to see systemic issues over years. This is another recently concluded outbreak, but it's not a recent outbreak. You can see it goes back 10 years. 10 years of a cheese product that once, twice, in 2021, maybe a few times, caused cases of illness, but never more than one at a time. This is something that would not have been even detected when you have one case of illness per year, were it not for whole genome sequencing. And again, looking in the facility, finding it in the product in the facility, and being able to look in the database and see that this has been a long-standing issue in this facility. And it does beg the question, well, why? Where was it? What were the practices? Were they not doing environmental monitoring? I often see companies doing environmental monitoring on the flat, shiny surfaces, not those more difficult to reach areas. And another example, different organism, Chronobacter in baby formula. So a year and a half ago, this was big news, very, very public news when you don't have baby formula available on store shelves. When there is a true shortage, it creates quite a panic. But the root of this also relates to the design of equipment and the harborage of the ability of a pathogen to find a niche and take up residence in a facility and equipment. So I think sometimes there's this pointing of fingers. Where is the issue? Is the issue with the design of the equipment? Is the issue with the people who are cleaning the equipment? And we know that if you have equipment that is of better hygienic design, that it really not relieves sanitation of their responsibility, but if you have equipment that's not cleanable, it's just not cleanable. And I think this has become a more pressing issue for the food industry as labor has become more difficult. How can we minimize the number of people who we need for sanitation? How can we have better sanitation, truly, better cleaning of equipment, because we see the vulnerabilities. Regulators are seeing the vulnerabilities. We can detect these things. So we want to do better than we ever did before, using less resources than we used before. So it's a tension there. So some common challenges that I see. Many of the facilities that I go into were built, their equipment was installed before we had any conversations like this. Maybe dairy had conversations like this, but many other parts of the industry had not. And so these are older equipments in older facilities. Some of the pieces of equipment are pretty customized, pretty unique. And so what is the motivation of an equipment manufacturer there's an efficiency if you can build many. When you're just building one at a time, cost can become an issue. Liz mentioned the equipment modifications, and this is an area where we see a lot of reuse of equipment, movement from one facility to another, maybe from one type of use to a different type of use. And education and the role of food safety. Food safety staff are not usually at the top of the totem poles. They are not always the decision makers within a company. Those who are looking for better hygienic design may not have as much influence within their company as other parts of management. So some of the challenges that I see are cost. You know, everybody complains about cost, but I never, although people talk about cost, I see tremendous recognition within the industry of value. So if they believe that the value is there, people are willing to invest a little bit extra, especially if they do the math and they look at the ongoing cost of maintaining equipment of poor hygienic design versus that you take the hit, get a new piece of equipment, but in the long run, see that this is the more efficient way to go. Boneyard equipment, the equipment that, say a facility decides, you know what, I'm going to do the right thing, I'm going to invest in something of better hygienic design, but what do they do with their old equipment? Where does it go? The dole harvesters got melted down. I know of some other companies who will melt down their equipment, but often it gets sold. So then you're just kind of passing that issue on to somebody else. There's also more recently, I heard a comment within the past year that I just had never thought of before, and that is when you have emerging industries. So the indoor vertical farms, the controlled environment ag, it's kind of like the .com era, and they're competing with each other to get their facilities up and running, and may be willing to make some compromises, may be willing to take whatever equipment, whatever infrastructure is available because they need to get their operation open so that they can, in the marketplace, continue producing and outcompete other companies. So I wanted to highlight a couple of issues and tie them in with a few sessions that I know are going on within this event. So some unique challenges. Moisture. Are we working in a wet environment? Are we working in a dry environment? I was excited to see the session on hygienic design for dry plants. It's a unique issue. Temperature. Are we working in cold? Are we working at ambient temperatures? Are we working in hot environments? And what are the different needs from an equipment standpoint when working in these very different environments? What is the food product, and how do the attributes, the chemistry of that product impact the type of sanitation, the type of chemicals that are going to be used, the interaction of those chemicals with the equipment, so whether we're working with a high protein product, fat, starch. I saw there were a couple of posters on biofilms looking at different combinations of organisms, but we know the nutrients that they're getting from the food can also influence the whole microbial ecology. The sanitation chemistry, what's available, what's being used, and then looking at specific industries and what are their unique needs. So I think from a food industry standpoint, some of the requests would be timing for new designs. We know that equipment can't be fabricated overnight, but what sort of time frame are we looking at when we're looking for improvements? How quickly can these improvements be made? How quickly and economically can there be evolution and development? And I have to think that it would be helpful and efficient if the industry would align, different parts of the industry, sort of align on their expectations and their needs. Guidance and partnership. So how can one make implant modifications appropriately, safely, and in adherence with good hygienic design? And so there's a session on hygienic redesign, which I think is an area that perhaps deserves more attention because it may be aspirational for a lot of companies to think about just replacing equipment. It's more, how do you look at what you have, evaluate what you have, and then modify it to be better tomorrow than it is today. Liz mentioned looking to the manufacturers, the fabricators, for recommendations on how cleanable is this equipment, and as a food company, how do I clean it? And it's a little disappointing to me sometimes when I work with food companies and they don't have any guidance. And when their equipment manufacturer says to them, I sold it to you, you bought it, and it's on you. I don't have any recommendations for what chemistry you should be using. You want to disassemble, figure it out. These are not constructive collaborative relationships, and I think that there is an opportunity for greater partnership here. And some common solutions, the retail food service buyers, I think they're in a great position they often impose requirements or expectations on their customers. Well, how attentive are they to hygienic design? Are they in a position that by setting expectations can help raise the bar across industries? And can those equipment manufacturers push and promote food safety, push and promote hygienic design? You all obviously are here today. Are you representative, as you think about your peers in the industry? Is everyone on the equipment manufacturer side on the same page in trying to further efforts on hygienic design? And so with that, I thank you for your time.